Okay, I'm going to introduce Tommaso and Lorenza to talk about the book launches. Take it away, Tommaso.
Okay, so we have planned to organize this session in two blocks. First, I will first talk about the Springs Odyssey, the book about this new low-cost electrified car that Renault, Nissan, and Dongfeng has created for the Chinese market, but they're actually selling in Europe. And then Lorenza will introduce the two other books that are dealing with the industrial policies in Asian countries. So that will be a separate kind of discussion. Start talking about, let's say, the Odyssey of the Dacia Spring, which is a book that is going to be published in English pretty soon. And Mark will tell us a little bit more about that. And so it's written by Marc Alochet, Christophe Midler, and Christophe de Charentenay. And I will start saying that this is part of a saga. It's not a single book. There is two other books that came before, and they're all about impossible projects. So the first project was the Logan, a 5,000 euros cars for the emerging markets in Europe. And we must say that is the only low-cost car ever produced in Europe by European car makers, and it remains the case. Then the second impossible project was the Kwid, which is a low-cost car to penetrate the Indian market at $3,500. And now the third impossible project is the electrified Kwid that is called Spring. So it's combining low-cost cars and electrification, which seem up until very recent time almost an impossible task. And so each of these stories have a common point, which is they're all in certain ways success, but sometimes not for the reason why they were first conceived. That's the common point. And each time is more challenging. The market challenge becomes more important, and also the cross-cultural management of it, because at the beginning is a French team working with some Romanian engineers and suppliers. Then it gets a French, Japanese team working with Indian suppliers and Indian companies. And now it gets a French, Japanese, and Chinese company, because Dongfeng is part of and creating this new car. So it's all the time getting more difficult. I will have a first question for you, Mark, on this, is that in the previous book, by Christophe Midler, Bernard Julien, and Yannick Lang on the Kwid, they highlighted how difficult it was. Bruce, we have a problem. How difficult it was to, or perhaps we don't, I don't know, to make the Japanese engineer of Nissan and the French engineer of Renault to work together in this project. And eventually, actually, the project was carried out mainly by the French engineering and also mainly produced in the French factory and not in the Nissan factory. So out this time, the cross-cultural cooperation work, and did you find out, again, problems or not? The second point that I would like to make is that what these three books have highlighted and keep in a very convincing way, that these are projects that require very specific organization that is absolutely unique, because in order to make this project, the design has to be made to a cost that is impossible to achieve. So the project cannot be nested within an existing engineering organization for producing cars, existing platform. It requires to have a very high degree of autonomy, and his task is to break down all the rules that prevented to make cars at this price before. So it's really a radical way of organizing engineering, conceiving cars. And I think that the three books have made this very clear. And my question is, if we experts of the automotive industry, that is also for you here, we would say, okay, what have been the most radical innovation of the last 20 years? I think very few of us would say the Dacia Logan, or would say the Kwid Renault. It doesn't come automatically say this is a radical innovation. Okay, this is a low-cost car, but it's not, you know, it would not be considered radical innovation. I do not agree with that. I think this is one of the most radical innovation we had in the last 20 years. And my question for you is, why it is not recognized as such? And the funny thing is not recognized as such even within Renault. Because Renault, they know in Renault, the people who work in Renault, that if Renault is still alive, is also, or perhaps mainly because of the Dacia brand. The Dacia brand has saved Renault during the last 20 years because it's been the most successful brand, because it's very profitable. But still, even Renault, when they think about success, innovation, they think about the Renault Zoe, the electric car, they think about the Alpine sport car, but this doesn't make any money, and the Dacia does. It does? Okay. So that would be my second question. Then the third point is about regulations, and you in your presentation you explain why the Spring has not been a success in China, because it was conceived to benefit from subsidize, and then the government has changed the range, the minimum autonomy that was required to get the subsidy, and suddenly, well, the Spring was not in the market anymore, and that killed the launch of the Spring in China. But then Renault found a new ways of using this innovation by importing the car in Europe, and is becoming one of the fast selling model of 2021 and 2022. My question is, was it planned, this, to sell the car to Europe, or it came out as something new? And I think this is a story repeating itself, because the Logan was the same. The Logan was conceived to be sold in the Central Eastern European markets. Then Europe decided to deregulate second-hand cars imports, and the markets were there not there anymore. And then Renault discovered that they could export this car in France, Italy, and Germany, become one of the best sold model of that year. So I think that this history of regulation tells us how much regulations are important to not regulate market, but to create or destroy markets. And also that there is a sort of blind spot in Renault, it seems to me, that they do not always see all the opportunity that these products have. And again, was it conceived for the European market or not? I didn't understand that. And I think I will stop here, and I will let you answer this question and open the QA to the.
The authors were able to see also, which we walked on the screen. So hopefully that will get working in a moment.
Yeah, I think we're going to start all over on the screen, but we can still go on with talking.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for Tommaso, for the introduction, for the three questions. The first one is, how difficult was it this time to develop this project? As you said, the very first one was developed by French engineers with some Romanian engineers and Romanian suppliers. The second one was developed in India. So we have to integrate some Indian engineers from a technical center, which is common with Renault and Nissan. Nissan engineer also participating. But in the case of the Kwid, what happened really is that only Renault engineers and engineers from India have been working together. Nissan was not really involved or interested in this project because that's supposed to be a low-end vehicle. Nissan has always considered it was not the DNA of the company. So they were not that involved. On this time for this vehicle in China, so Nissan was again a player, but roughly it happened the same thing. They were not that much involved because again, they don't consider this is the DNA of the company. On the other side, they have an alternative vehicle they were developing exactly at the same time. So Nissan was, I would say, a side partner. They were not directly involved. But the cooperation between the French engineers and the Chinese engineers, and also some Indian engineers. Because in fact, as the vehicle is an electrification of a vehicle which was initially developed in India, it was very important to use all the skill, knowledge, of competencies of the Indian engineers who were at the origin of the thermal engine platform. So how did they work together? Actually, I think there were two two main points. The first one was the organization of the company. It was an independent company. It was a company funded by both Renault, Nissan, and Dongfeng, but which has an autonomy of decision. And this is very important because you get rid at the first level of the impact of the companies, of the parent companies. You don't belong to Renault, you don't belong to Nissan, you don't belong to Dongfeng, you belong to a company which has a responsibility to develop this product and sell it on the market. And this is one of the first reasons for the success. The second one is, of course, you have very huge differences in culture. I mean, French engineer, Chinese engineers, and Indian engineers, they don't think in the same way, they don't have the same education, and they don't have the same habits in working. So the idea was to really work them together in a very small area, to have common objectives, and also a short schedule, which was split in very short steps, very short stages. And every 1 or 2 months, you have a new step to achieve. And all the people was committed to work together to achieve this result, which was the main objective, the main target of this company, because this company was created to develop this project. And the third point, which has been also very important, is that, of course, all these engineers, they don't speak the same language, but one, which is English. And what has been done was to select people who had a double culture. So you had people, for instance, who were Chinese, but who have been studying in Europe. Or you have people the other way around, we were French, but have been studying or working in China for quite a long time. And all of them, they were working in English together. And that was also another reason that make people working together more easily. And when they have some trouble of language, and they can understand each other, they do some drawing. On engineering, when you do some drawings to explain very basically what you want to do, everything understand. So that was what has been done in terms of organization. The second point was, okay, it has been a great success for Dacia and for Renault. This is right. The Dacia brand is very profitable. This is one of the, I think, probably, I wouldn't say this is the only brand which gains more and more personal customers year after year. Probably there are other brands, but this is one of them. And this is very rare. So it has to be mentioned. And these vehicles are very profitable. So why does it happen and why it is not recognized? I think that for other car makers, this is very different. What you want to do is that first, you think a new vehicle or a new platform in the mature country where you have your headquarters, so in Detroit, in Munich, or in Wolfsburg, or Paris, or wherever you want in the mature country, and you want innovation to start by the high-end, and after that you have innovation trickle down to the low-end product. And after that, you think, okay, we have this product which is successful in a mature country, and we want to sell this product in other countries. And this is the way that most of the car makers actually think about developing new products on new platforms. Renault is doing it completely another way for the Dacia brand. First, they want to start from the low end of the range, so it's accessible vehicle, affordable vehicle, and they first develop it for local markets where they know there is a need. That was the idea at the very beginning with the Logan for Romania, and more widely for all the countries of Central or Eastern Europe. That was the idea for the Kwid in India, and this is again the idea with the electrification of the Kwid in China. So there is a local need on a local market, and you develop this vehicle specifically for the local need on this local market. And this is very different from what other automakers do usually. But what is even more interesting is that once you have developed this vehicle in this specific market, after that you have what we call a lineage management, and starting from this vehicle, then you develop new products for other countries. If I just stick to the story of the Kwid, so initially it's a vehicle which has been developed in India for India. There was an adaptation for Brazil, and then the vehicle is electrified in China, and now it is sold in Europe. And this is also a unique capacity, which is how to start from a local product, from just a local market in a specific country, even if the Chinese market is a huge one, I agree with that. But anyway, starting from this point, and after that, you think how to spread and how to have much more products in many different countries. But also, this is quite unique in a way of developing new products on new platform. You say this is not recognized inside Renault. I wouldn't say exactly that. This is what is called ambidexterity, which is how, on the one side, continue to develop the mainstream product for the mature market. And this is obviously where most of your engineering knowledge and competencies are. On just this side, you have a small team with huge level of autonomy. We can take decision. We can decide to not to use the usual technical standards of the company. And suddenly, or not suddenly, but because there is a decision, but anyway, is developing a new product apart in a completely independent way from what is done in the corporate function of the company. And this is ambidexterity. So how to manage at the same time business as usual and radical innovation. And ambidexterity is quite well known inside Renault. And this example, of course, is the last one, but as Tommaso said, that was the Queen in India, the Logan, and the Alpine, the sporty car has been developed exactly in the same way. So this is a methodology, a strategy, which is quite well known inside Renault. But on the other side, when you do that, it means that the team developing this product has a full autonomy, which means that people from the corporate division, product and planning, engineering, quality, and so on, they don't have a word to say on what's happening in this project. They have only a role of support, which means that when there is a very huge difficulties and the team developing the project doesn't know how to solve it, then they say, hey, please, we need help. And this is very difficult when you are in a corporate function, in engineering, which was my case inside Renault for more than 30 years, then seeing just, say, 100 people developing a car, not telling you what they are doing, and suddenly they raise their hand and say, hey, we need some help. And in this way, it's true that it is very difficult to recognize inside the company that you are working on the mainstream project and you have people aside developing something completely out of the box, getting rid of all the standards of the company. And in this way, this is so that it is difficult to recognize this kind of project may happen in the company. And the third question is, okay, so just to say it very briefly, so the vehicle was developed in schedule with a very good result in terms of cost, because the cost is about 2/3 of the same product as it has been developed in Europe. The beginning of the sale is very good, and suddenly there are many opposing waves at the beginning of 2020. I'm not going to explain it in detail now, I don't have time, but the vehicle doesn't sell anymore in China. And then there is a decision to sell the vehicle in Europe. And your question is, was it planned at the very beginning? And in fact, the answer is yes. It was planned at the very beginning, but again, the vehicle was mainly developed for the Chinese market. But it means in terms of requirements, regulation, safety issue, and so on, the vehicle was developed to match the Chinese market. It was not developed to match the European market. But in the design, I would say in the overall design, there was nothing forbidding to sell it in Europe later on. And this is what has been done. Adaptation, and quite light adaptation, has been done to make possible to sell the vehicle in Europe. This is one of the first decisions which make it possible to sell it in Europe. And the second one was in terms of reservation of capacity production in the plant in China. Because at the very beginning, the product was supposed to be sold only in China, which means an expected market of a number of vehicles to sell in the Chinese market. Plus, there was an option to sell the vehicle in Europe on an additional reservation of capacity. And what has been done is adaptation of the design of the vehicle on the one side, and using this production capacity, which have been made in reservation for the opportunity to sell the vehicle in Europe. Okay, I think I've answered your main questions. I don't know if there are additional questions. Okay, good.
Because you don't have the sound either. Is this the screen?
Yeah. This is the Electron laptop and gives the screen automatically.
I use the
Display control.
so
It's on.
in case we don't manage to reactivate the projector right now, we sent you all received the link to the Zoom meeting so that you can also see the speakers and their slides. I'm sorry, this is a second best strategy.
Situation, yeah.
Yeah. But the speakers are here online, so you,
It's going to work. Yeah.
Magic.
okay, so just one, thank you, John and Rick for the patience. We're getting there. We had a problem with the projector in the meantime. But if you want and you are in front of a screen, you can also watch the session via your laptops, both on Zoom and on YouTube. You have both links.
Okay. Display control. Now what would close? Yeah, you can close. Yes. It's on. Hear them?
Can you hear us from the other side, John and Rick? Screen is okay, fine, we made it. Thanks for the patience, everyone. So we will now shift to other two books. We have the honor to present two different books, two very relevant books for our audience. One is the book by Richard Donner, Greg Noble, and John Ravenhill on the political economy of automotive industrialization in East Asia. And the other volume is the book by Kaoru Natsuda and John Toburn on automotive industrialization, industrial policy and development in Southeast Asia. So these two books, we will have a combined discussion because they have in common an endeavor to explain the development trajectory of different countries in East Asia, the development trajectory of the automobile industry in 7 in one case, 5 countries in the other case, and to provide a political economy explanation of industrial development trajectories and of the developmental outcomes derived by certain industrial policy strategies. They also have they also adopt different conceptual frameworks, and they also differ in their interpretation of the same case studies. For example, Thailand, I would say, does not. There are some points, controversial points between the interpretation of the Thai case studies. So what we will do here, I won't spend too long. I will just give a few, like 3 key questions that will allow our speakers to provide some highlights of their books. So I will raise these questions and then I will give both the 3 of them the chance to reply, to engage with these 3 questions. And then we will, if we still have time, we will open the floor to questions for them, but also if there are remaining questions to Mark, we can still have a Q&A session, short Q&A session with the audience. So, hello, John and Rick, welcome. Thanks for the patience and for joining us again. So, what I would like you to engage with I have three main points. One point I would appreciate if you could provide an answer on the value of comparison. So from a methodological and analytical perspective, since these are very difficult endeavors to combine, to compare very different development trajectories, what do you reply in terms of value of comparison? What did you learn? What did you recommend also from a methodological perspective to others engaging in the same task? One point. Second point is about the unit of analysis that you embrace, that you cover in your books. Since you also analyze, out of all the cases you analyze, there are also 4 overlapping cases, i.e. Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. But in the first book, so the book by Donner, Ravenhill, and Noble, you tend to privilege a country perspective, while John and Kaoru tend to engage more with the regional perspective. So with a focus on the Asian subject and on the regional value chain in Southeast Asia. So why was this? And how do you respond to why you chose this particular perspective, even analyzing the same cases? And the third question that I would raise is, how would you define your, let's call it, explanatory variable? So what accounts in your book for differences between these countries? What is the variable, the main variable you use to assess successes and failures of these industries? So if you could give a short answer, this will also allow the audience to understand your main conceptual apparatus in a few words. I know it's difficult, but we will do our best to give our audience a little flavor of your books. If they haven't read them yet, they will do so later, but they will have a little taste here. I leave it to you, Richard and John, and then John. I know you might have some slides. You can share your screen if you want, but I leave it to you. Let's try with 5 minutes each. Let's try 10 minutes each, and then we see. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Lorenza. From what you're saying, I'm assuming we are going to try to address the 3 questions, and then we pass things over to John for his take on all 3 questions. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So first off, apologies to everyone that we don't have a recording on the program. We've had a number of mishaps and misadventures, but we have included on this title slide here a link to an earlier presentation of the book. And I mean, that is a much more detailed one. And so we would encourage anyone who's interested to follow up and look at that earlier presentation. So your first question is all about comparison. Well, I mean, this is what our book is about. We are students of comparative politics or comparative political economy. Now, there's an old Canadian joke that Canadians preface every sentence with, "I'm sorry." Well, in this instance, I'm sorry, but we are political scientists, and we come at this project from a political science perspective. Now, comparison is the foundation for our study, and we have 7 countries that we look at on the screen here: China, Indonesia, the Republic of Korea, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Thailand. Why these countries? Well, I'll come on to that in a little while, but the basis for comparison here is that in the 1960s and 1970s, their auto industries were all at approximately the same position. They were small, domestically oriented industries that governments were attempting to promote through classic import substitution policies. Now, in the next quarter of a century, both the strategies and the trajectories of these industries diverged dramatically. This divergence provides us with our core questions for comparative analysis. Why did the strategies differ? What were the consequences of pursuing one approach rather than another? What were the policy and institutional requirements for success in pursuing these different strategies? So that's why comparison. Well, why East Asia? Well, frankly, this is where we had our personal expertise and language skills as well, or at least my co-authors had language skills. I struggle in English, yet alone anything else beyond that. Why a country focus? Well, because we're interested in the role that the state can play in promoting upgrading. It's not that we think that value chains, supply chains are unimportant, but rather we are interested in how states can most effectively engage with them. Why these particular 7 countries? Well, they're all latecomers. So our starting point was to rule out Japan, even though our other author who's not with us today, Greg Noble, has enormous expertise on the Japanese industry. But of the latecomers, these are the major players in the region. We probably should have included Vietnam, but at some point we had to make a decision, how can we keep this book manageable? As it is, it comes in at well over 400 pages. And we thought, well, why not extend it to South Asia to include India? That would make for interesting comparisons as well. Or to some of the countries that Greg Mordew in the previous session referred to as the semi-periphery. Well, yes, but this thing took us long enough as it was. We had to get it finished. Now, in our final chapter, we did attempt to apply lessons learned from our 7 cases to other parts of the world. But these are very much sort of shadow cases rather than cases that we could develop in any detail. So that's my attempt at answering your first 2 questions, Lorenza. And again, we really do appreciate your patience with us and your encouragement of us. We realize that we have caused you more problems than we should have done. So now over to Rick to talk about the basis for our comparison here.
Great, thanks, John. So one point on the unit of analysis, and that is that it's country. And the basis for that, to expand on what John said, the basis for that is that where you see variation is at the country level, not so much at the firm level. There's certainly variation within these countries as to which is stronger, but as Sanjay Alal wrote many, many years ago, where you see in terms of industrial development is the variation is with regard to the country as opposed to the firm, the most important variation. So variation with regard to what? So we certainly agree that Thailand has been a success. But what we try to do is to look beyond a general perspective of success to differentiate types of growth. One which characterizes Thailand is what we call extensive growth, which is really assembly and exports under the control and guidance of multinational corporations, right? And this is really characterized by what people typically talk about economic diversification. That is, the auto industry took a greater weight in the overall economy, or lesser weight. We distinguish that from intensive growth, which is much more focused on the ability of domestic firms to develop the capabilities to move into higher value added activities at global levels. So the point here is upgrading. This is all about innovation by local firms, okay? And there the emphasis on learning. Now, so we distinguish we distinguish in 2 levels of variation: who has tried to go to extensive growth and succeeded, who has tried to go to intensive growth and succeeded. Our arguments, John, the next one. You can just keep going down. Okay, arguments are 3 things, and I will just stop here. first of all, the argument is that you cannot talk about policy requirements of automotive industrial policy in general, that we distinguish between what is required for extensive growth versus intensive growth. And we argue that, in fact, intensive growth is much more difficult. Because it's more difficult, the policies involved with intensive growth have different institutional requirements. That is, we have a prediction that we should see certain kinds of institutions and capacities in those countries that have achieved intensive growth versus those that have achieved extensive growth. Lastly, we assume that institutions are political beings, that institutions are difficult to create, and that they are responses to political pressures and opportunities faced by people. So I'm going to let me make one more point here. I think I don't want to go on too long.
Better or worse?
The point I would like to make is that we have given this presentation in the past, and what is striking is that participants from business schools and even from GERPISA, we don't think really got our main point. Our main point, the focus of most people who have responded from the industry and business world is, well, what about the firm? What about the industry itself? And our argument is that firm performance and national industry performance has to do with the institutions and the political context in which firms operate. And so I would strongly encourage those of you for participants to take this a little bit more seriously. That is, we're not talking about what goes on within the firms. We're talking about the context that encourages firms to conduct themselves in one way or another. This last slide simply speaks to some of the political pressures that we identify, that we argue help to account for intensive growth promoting institutions. The argument is that those countries that face severe external threats and internal pressures and lack natural resources will tend to promote the growth of efficiency and upgrading related institutions that lead to different kinds of firm behavior. Thanks.
Thank you very much. John, we leave it to you.
Okay, well, I should explain Kauru's absence, because we had intended to do this together, that he's going to be doing a presentation at a conference in Thailand at the end of the month, and we decided he would do the Taiwan presentation and I would do GERPISA. To try to answer some of your questions, firstly, why ASEAN? And like the previous speakers, that has a lot to do with my past research. I started with my doctoral thesis on Malaysia, on primary commodity exports and development. I studied the tin industry in the late 70s in Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. I studied the garment industry in Vietnam in the 2000s, and then in Cambodia with some Japanese colleagues. And then we moved to vehicles in Southeast Asia from 2010. So why ASEAN? Well, ASEAN as a group, the five producers the main producers of ASEAN that we cover in our case study, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, they're almost as important in terms of total output as is Germany. So they're quite a formidable grouping. And I was interested, Lorenza, by your idea that we treat it very regionally. And I think we hadn't done that explicitly. It just came along. And if I could, I haven't got the facilities to bring a slide up on the screen without taking a lot of time. But if people look at my presentation later and they look at slide number 10, which is on Toyota's complementation trade in Southeast Asia, you see how so much of the trade is so much of the production network is regionally based. So that for Toyota, Philippines produces manual transmissions for all the other countries. Thailand produces diesel engines for Indonesia. Indonesia produces gasoline engines for Thailand, and so on and so on. So that an important part of the production setup in ASEAN has been the impact of the development of free trade, tariff-free trade within ASEAN, which, as an earlier slide of mine says, was very strongly driven, not by ASEAN as an organization, so if we look at slide 13, but by individual Japanese companies who wanted to have complementation between their factories in component factories and their assembly factories in different countries. And they pushed with limited schemes. And then finally, those limited schemes became the ASEAN Free Trade Area. So in 2010, 4 of the 5 producers moved to tariff-free trade. And the 5th producer, Vietnam, moved to tariff-free trade in 2018. And that's brought about some interesting shifts. Now, the purpose of comparisons, well, all of the Southeast Asian countries at the end of the war were basically primary commodity exporters, not always the same package of products, but fairly similar, especially Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And the way that they industrialized, we think, is interesting. Now, when we started in 2010, it was quite clear that foreign direct investment was dominant, except for Malaysia, and in a way, even in Malaysia. And so we were, as it were, necessarily looking at what Rick Donor and his colleagues would call extensive growth. Although we were interested in how foreign investors would spread growth to local producers. And Rick and his colleagues would know my views on their book because I wrote quite a long review article on it. And they'll know that I have a very high opinion of it, but I think they've been a bit tough on Thailand. And I think they've started out with the feeling that Thailand that Thailand hasn't done that well. And I think if you judge Thailand by the standards of Korea, yes, it hasn't. But I think they could perhaps be a bit kinder to Thailand, that Thailand has some soft industrial policies. It spread a lot of development to domestic firms via joint ventures. So if we looked at the pyramid of production, which is one of my slides, among first tier, although the assemblers are all foreign, first tier suppliers, foreign firms, totally foreign firms are less than a third of both the second tier, first tier and the second tier. And domestic firms have a significant presence. And some other research we did a while ago on comparing Thailand with Czechia, the Czech Republic, and interviewed one major Japanese assembler there, who I'm afraid can't be named. That assembler bought from 88 firms in Czechia, and only one of those firms was local. You know, that's a very big difference between Thailand, where, you know, 2/3 of the firms are either local or have joint ventures. The differences between countries, we were economists rather than coming from a political background. So we, I think, look at the issues more narrowly, and we look at the implementation of hard industrial policies. And by hard, I mean directive policies. And the policies we particularly looked at were vertical, that's to say sector-specific policies, and things like the tariff structure, the local content requirements, mandatory deletion policies, foreign exchange balancing. which we think have worked rather well in ASEAN, that the activities which were started as a result of local content requirements, or in the case of the Philippines, foreign exchange balancing, they've outlived their abolition by the WTO in 2000. And in fact, Thailand and to some extent Malaysia have found ways of circumventing the WTO prohibitions on trade-related industrial policies through their product champion approach, making concessions, like tax concessions for producers, dependent on achieving local content. So the WTO hasn't even been so effective in that case. I think Malaysia, if we compare, we've written one paper comparing Malaysia and Thailand, and then another on Philippines versus Indonesia. The Malaysian case, I think, is a case of potentially significant policy developing a large national producer, degenerating into rent seeking. There's a very, very good book by a guy called Firdausi Sufian from Malaysia, based on his doctoral thesis, which looks at the details of the rent seeking. And it seems that unlike Korea, where the incentives were made conditional on performance, in Malaysia they weren't made conditional, and the incentives have been generously accepted, but the performance hasn't been delivered. I would like to draw out one point which I made in the review article of Rick Donor and his colleagues' book, which is one of the lessons that I would draw from Korea compared to Malaysia, is not that companies like the national company in Malaysia, Proton, it's not that those countries are unique in facing difficulties. One of the things that I got from the extremely interesting study in the Donor book of Korea is that Korea itself and companies like Hyundai had major problems with product quality. They had to stop trying to supply Western markets and had to move to developing country markets. And the difference between them and Proton is that they solved those problems and Proton never did. So the problems come up, but some companies solve them and not others. And although, I mean, my sense is that I got out of that Korea case study a lot of information about the development of Hyundai. I mean, I got a lot on the environment, but I got a lot also on the company itself. We had, I think, an interesting point of entry in our study that one of us, Kaoru, was Japanese, and many of the interviews, well, most of the interviews all the interviews with assemblers and many interviews with suppliers were with Japanese companies, and very, very useful to be able to conduct the interviews in Japanese. I mean, it was a sort of point of entry, I think, a Westerner simply wouldn't have got without the language, and perhaps even with the language. So that we felt that was a distinctive advantage of our work. And also there's quite a substantial literature in Japanese on the motor industry in Asia. And again, we've been able to access that. So I think that's been quite successful. We don't pretend to really look at the political economy. It just wasn't our strength. When we're both economists, from our earliest days, and we've done our best as economists. So the stress of our book is somewhat different. And when we tried to compare Indonesia and the Philippines, it was very difficult. That Indonesia has applied its policies more effectively than the Philippines. Philippines has had terrible problems with imported second-hand cars. And the Philippines, although it seemed to develop not too badly until 2004, when ASEAN tariffs came down to close to zero. It then saw an import surge. And the difference we've seen between Indonesia and the Philippines is that Indonesia's very substantial market growth, motorization, has been met by domestic production, and the Philippines has just been met by imports. And the chief executive officer of a Japanese company in Indonesia, a Japanese person, he said that his company was much more influenced by market growth than by the details of policy. Although he said that policy in some cases, like Malaysia, could be so bad that it would be very off-putting. Okay, I think I'm probably reaching the end of.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for a Q&A, right? We have only 2 minutes if there is. Okay, we have time for a short Q&A. If anybody wants to share some comments or raise some questions, I would invite you to come here because it works better. In any case, let me repeat that on the GERPISA website, this session was just meant to give you some highlights, but we also have a longer presentation recorded by John for the colloquium, and a longer video from a book launch seminar that we held with Rick, John, and Greg last year, also on our website. So you can also watch these longer presentations, and of course you're invited to buy their books. Anybody from the audience, or we conclude this first intense day here? I think the audience is very tired, but we thank you very much for participating, for bearing with us, and all the mails and the links and all the technical issues, but we were very glad to have you with us. We hope you will engage with this audience face to face in on another occasion. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the audience and our participants.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
And here.
Wait a minute. Not yet.
Mm.